Hey there, welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, filmmakers, photographers, all different people who are writing stuff and putting stuff out in the Bronx. And we thought we'd do something special because something unusual and frankly very difficult happened in our borough, and that was the nurses' strike that recently has been settled. And we have a reporter in our first segment who wrote about it, and we're going to talk in depth about what happened and what some of the fallout might be. And in our second segment, we have the head of the Nurses Association that is going to join us. So we'll be able to break down what the negotiations were like, et cetera, et cetera. So should be a rather interesting and intensive program. Let's start off with Bahar Ostaden, who's the accountability reporter. We'll find out what that means with WNYC Gothamist. Bahar, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Let's just start there. Who is the accountability reporter? We're all accountable.
It's a great question. Someone on my team described it the other day in a way that I liked, which was holding the local city government accountable for what it says it will and won't do. So I think kind of crosses a lot of different spheres, but I started recently, so we'll see how it plays out.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know that I've ever heard. I mean, we've heard of like an efficiency person in a company, where they make sure that they're spending money right. But an accountability report. All right, we're going to chase you around for a while and find out how that works out. And then just before we get into the nurses' strike, which you have written about, I'm just curious about you. How did you end up here, where you are at one of the very important places in New York City, and that is WNYC Gothamist?
Yeah, so I had mostly done freelance reporting before this, and actually was doing like totally non-journalistic work. I was in data analytics for a while, but the more I wrote and did interviews on the side of my job, the more I wanted to do it full time. And so I feel very lucky to work here. I went back to school for journalism, and somehow they let me into the office. So it's been a fun ride so far.
Yeah. When you say back to school, did I read that you went to the Craig Newmark School? Is that what
I went to Columbia Journalism.
The Columbia Journalism. Oh, a little place like that.
Little place uptown.
Yeah, it's uptown. Well, that's great. And just that one last question before we get into the nurses' strike. What do you like about doing this? What for you is the interesting thing? Because you're making people accountable. Is that
I think, yeah, that. I personally just love that I get to meet people who I never otherwise would speak to, probably, if this wasn't my job, across all parts of the city. That for me is like consistently the most fulfilling part.
I guess that leads us right into the nurses' strike. So, in order to cover this, did you go to the strike? Did you talk to nurses? I mean, how did you? You wrote two stories. One was what New Yorkers need to know as they begin the nurses' strike, and then the second was nurses detailed turmoil inside New York City hospitals amid the strike, with a quote of "People don't know what they're doing." So in order to do the reporting, let's start there. What'd you do to gather the info? Was it phone calls? I mean, that's possible.
Mostly phone calls, because to be honest, I was focused on getting people who were still inside the hospital at the time of the strike and less people who were on the picket line. Because
that would have been great. I'm a nosy reporter. Can I just wander around for a while?
Can I just pop in? Yeah.
Get through hospital security at Mount Sinai and Montefiore. Good luck.
Right. Especially then, that they would have loved that.
Yeah, right. Oh, goodness.
So yeah, it was mostly, like we'd meet people on the picket line, and they would introduce us to people who were either travel or agency nurses who were still working inside because they couldn't join the strike. So it was mostly, I mean, as you know, too, nurses, their hours are pretty crazy. It's just kind of text messages and phone calls at whatever hour they were able to get information out.
I'm going to use the word pain because that's, a large part of being a nurse is, relieving pain. There was pain all over. The nurses didn't want to have to strike. They have been pained because they have been, they believed that they were being abused, and ultimately the patients were being abused. So there was pain there. And certainly the hospital neither hospital, let's talk about Mount Sinai and Montefiore, which were the last two holdouts. Neither of those institutions certainly wanted to see this kind of chaos and threat to patient care, et cetera, et cetera. So this really was about pain. And by the way, in our second segment, we'll have the head of the Nurses Association. How definitive were they that it's worth making the sacrifice, potentially losing pay, potentially compromising patients who they care for? Were they hardline? Were they strong about their beliefs?
That my understanding is yes. I think, like you said, nurses were upset that they had to leave their patients, especially nurses who work in, like the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, where we have premature and critically ill babies, newborn babies. They're emotionally attached to their patients in a lot of those instances, and I think they were upset to have to leave them. But most nurses I spoke to said this is long overdue. So there was one ER nurse at Montefiore who said on an average night, he is responsible for up to 25, he said 20 to 25 patients in the emergency room at a
In the
time.
emergency room?
Yeah. So for him, he's like,
every one of them has an emergent problem. 25
right,
people.
right, which is pretty unbelievable. And at on an average night when he has that, he said the hospitals don't make any efforts to redirect ambulances, for example, which is something they did during the strike.
Mm-hmm.
So I think nurses were upset, but this was a long time coming, it sounds like.
There's no question about it, but is the underlying, I've got to ask this question on behalf of the hospitals, is the real underlying issue that there's a big nursing shortage, that we don't have enough nurses? And so even if we wanted to give you more nurses, we don't have them. Or do you believe the resources are there at least to deal with it?
It's a good question. The nurses union, which I'm sure you'll ask in the next segment too, say that there are up to 600 to 700 nursing vacancies in each of the hospitals. So they claim this has been true for years now. The hospitals themselves aren't as open about the numbers. It's a little bit unclear how many nurses they think are required to staff the hospitals
Right,
to a
of
sustainable
course.
degree. So it's a little bit hard to tell, but it seems like now that the strike is over and they've reached a deal, hopefully we've reached healthier staffing ratios that will actually be enforced in the future in a way they haven't before.
I should mention, and I'll mention it in our second segment as well, it's of some comfort that Lehman College is literally building a building as we speak. That will be the nursing building where they'll educate more nurses. Boy, we certainly need it. And then from the hospital side, did you get a lot of kind of like crying in our towel, like, we can't do it because we don't have the nurses? Or were they just really somewhat standoffish?
That I didn't hear so much from them about, there aren't enough nurses. They were sort of, disappointed that it came to this. I think negotiations had been underway throughout the fall last year, and they weren't able to reach an agreement with the nurses union. So I think they were frustrated it even took the 3 days, but negotiations went through. I think it was like 3 a.m. on Thursday morning when it finally both Montefiore and Sinai reached a deal. So I think at the end of the day, everyone just seemed relieved. From what I heard from nurses, they were satisfied with a lot of their demands being met, both in terms of pay, healthcare benefits, and staffing. So we'll keep monitoring. Hopefully, this will mean nurses will have healthier patient ratios in the future, but maybe it's too soon to tell.
And frankly, a little more sanity in their own lives and their own personal lives,
Right.
because their dedication over the last few years in particular is, without question.
Definitely.
Here's a question you can't answer, and I know you're going to work on it. I had been thinking all along, so just visualizing myself. Okay, so you don't do elective surgery, and people who didn't have to come into the hospital, they didn't. But people got hurt, people got shot, people got cut. They needed stitches right away. The fallout from this has not been talked about yet. We mentioned before the show in our dialogue that something's going to have to unravel. Do you have a sense of the disaster that it was? Unlike when you go to a car accident, you kind of know what the disaster was. Here, I don't know. Did we do okay? I would certainly hope that nobody got hurt as a result.
Yes and no. It's hard to say because, as you can imagine, it's difficult to get information from hospitals about patient care and treatment. I'll say we spoke to a nurse who said, as of Monday morning, which is when the strike started, there were only 3 nurses working in the ICU in Mount Sinai, where typically there are 7 to 8. that nurse said, she was asked to take care of twice as many patients as usual. So she was responsible for 4 patients in the intensive care unit versus typically 1 or 2. She said the nurses that remained there were asked to work twice as many days in a row, so up to 5 consecutive days, and very long shifts, something like 13 to 14 hours. So, you can imagine that the nurses that remained in there, seems like, especially on some units, were under a lot of pressure and were
Yeah,
stretched pretty thin.
I'm sure. I just hope that there was no serious casualty as a result. I can understand you putting off elective surgery. Before we run out of time, you and I mentioned before the show, as part of accountability, is how are we going to measure the mayor's plan to take mentally ill people off the street, even without their consent? At what point is it a good idea to start measuring, is this a good program or not?
It's a good question. We've been talking to civil liberties experts at the New York Civil Liberties Union, and they say in most cases involuntary hospitalization is not warranted. It's an infringement upon your individual liberties and rights as a person. I think a lot of mental health experts say there's a more holistic, community-based approach to a lot of the issues that people in the city are having. It just will require someone who's committed to investing the money in those sorts of solutions, as opposed to,
Yeah, and then the other thing is, I mean, our mental health capacities are exploding, and you're going to put more people in some system. The history will show. You just got to look at the homeless population, that people are going to get lost in that system, and you're going to, So it will be interesting to see. Is he going to be able to make it work? And certainly, I can understand safety and security for all involved, but I don't know that this is the way to do it. We'll find out, I suppose. And you will find out first, and then we will find out from you.
there we
Bahar
go.
Ostaden from the Accountability Reporter from WNYC Gothamist. Thank you so much. Say hello to David and all our friends over there. And we appreciate you taking the time to be with us on the Bronx Buzz. And we're definitely going to call you and have you back again. Keep writing, and that's what
Great.
you're going to get.
Thanks for having me on. Take
All right,
care.
great. All right, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, yes, we will have the head of the New York Nurses Association. So